Zellers.
Thank you, and wow, that was a lot. You got a lot in a little bit of time there.
You'll learn. You're new to this.
I was going to say that the only thing left was the Viking Stadium. The court case in itself, I wouldn't say be careful what you wish for. And this is where I'll inject a little partisan politics. We wouldn't have been there if at the end of session the leadership in the House and Senate would come up with a balanced budget. Now, there's a lot of talk that they did have a balanced budget, but it included a massive tax increase. Massive tax increase, and what I would guess would be about 70% of the people in this room. If you're an S Corp, an LLC, an LLP, you file your business and your income taxes together, you are going to be hit with a fourth tier tax bracket of 9%. Now, in a down economy, if you want a preview of what happens when you do that, look to the east and look at Michigan. Or if you'd like a sunnier version, look at California. They're on the brink of bankruptcy because they raised taxes during a tough economic time. Business owners, the one thing you'll see in that $1.2 billion budget deficit is that 70% of that came from personal income. Usually when we generate deficits, there's a lot of things that go into there in our high corporate tax rate. When we're flush, like we were in the 06 year, we had a $3.5 billion or $3 billion surplus. When things go south, then we fall off the table that much faster and that much harder. But when you look at this latest version, usually it's not that much out of the personal income, 70%. That means people either lost jobs, or in my case, my neighbor next door, Sasha, took a 40% hit in his pay. When we talk about whether or not to raise taxes, fees, whatnot, there isn't the money left out there. The average taxpayer, the average business owner in this room doesn't have another 2, 3, 4, 10, 15% to pay to the government. So the reason we were in the lawsuit business was that there was a failure of leadership. At the end of the session, they proposed a whole bunch of spending, and we talk about kicking the can down the street. The GAMC, and I have to be careful because the GMAC bailout has been in the news lately. You got to keep the two separate. But the GAMC was growing at a 30+% clip. It would eclipse the entire Health and Human Services budget, the education budget, the state budget within less than a decade. That's a lot of money. So kicking the can down the road by just letting the program continue to grow wasn't the responsible thing to do. I would have liked to have the discussion there, and we got close to it at the end of the session, but when there's money left, there's spending left without money to fill the budget, the governor had to do something. Now, whether or not that comes up again, I think it will. I don't think that some of the groups were afraid. I've talked to many of them who said, look, we would have rather had a solution. We're not afraid that if we sue the state of Minnesota, and let's be honest, the activist judge that the plaintiff went to has done this before to Arnie Carlson and Jesse Ventura, so it's not as if this is some new grand idea. She's been known for doing this. On appeal, I think the governor will be upheld because the basis of the case was it was the February forecast. Well, since then we had another forecast, the $1.2 billion we're talking about, and the governor didn't, no one I don't think at the Capitol had any idea it'd be $1.2 billion. 500-600 million, which is a lot of money. Let's not cloud that fact. But no one had an idea it'd be over $1 billion. So the urgency that was supposed to be there to be created was still there in November. It was just a little different down the road a little bit. So I think it's quite honestly a lot of and it was one part. There was many parts of the unallotment that could have been brought suit, and there's a reason they haven't, because it wouldn't, even with this activist judge, wouldn't have passed the sniff test. So it'll come back to the session, and I think we have to make this decision anyway, because we're talking about two government-run healthcare programs trying to service a little bit different populations, but they're still just two government-run healthcare programs that the state runs. Why not combine them? Just like you've had to combine divisions of your business, maybe your transportation guy is now also helping out with some of the inventory. Maybe the folks that are doing route sales are also doing a little bit of paperwork at the end of the day back in the office. So it's not as if government can't have a combination. And in tough economic times, you've got to have some of this stuff. There's no more money to be had out there from you, the business owners, or from the taxpayers. So I just don't see that a lawsuit is going to have this monumental effect. Again, it's an activist judge on appeal. It will probably be upheld. And quite honestly, when we have to make that tough decision on what to do about the program, that's what should have happened last spring. It didn't, so we'll be back at it again next year.
I looked up activist judge in the dictionary. It's a judge that rules against you. Democrats would say it was an activist judge that put George Bush in office. Republicans would say it's an activist judge who ruled in this case. And then Kurt said, the governor had to do what he had to do. That's saying, well, If we can't cooperate, if we can't negotiate with people who think differently than we can break the law and violate the Constitution. And see, that's where I think it's not to be careful what you wish for. There are laws in place for a reason. And that's just a fact of life, you know. You can't just say, well, I can't get along with my neighbor, so I'm going to do something against the law to him because we got a fence issue and we can't figure it out, so I'm just going to bulldoze his fence. Well, what else could I do? I mean, that's just not a good enough excuse, I don't think.
Well, but the unallotment statute is in law, and just because they don't like the way it was used or don't prefer the method, something had to be done. Our Constitution, another part of the law, says we have to have a balanced budget. We have to have a balanced budget, and when it comes to using the courts for services, if you prefer not activist judge, then a liberal judge that wanted to spend money, because what we had was a friend of the court brief produced by one of our House committees. We used what's called the nonpartisan. These are folks that have PhDs and law degrees down at the Capitol, and they're nonpartisan. They don't carry the GOP or DFL moniker when they're working on this stuff. They're in a committee. They try to help us make better laws, which that's why they're nonpartisan, because it's a full-time job. But we had a group of a committee of our legislature that put together a friend of the court brief. It came with an absolute determined decision that it will be, whatever the governor's done is unconstitutional, has to be found. Those of us in the minority, I asked in the committee, if we asked you to find the other side of the coin, would you? No, we can't. The majority has said, this is the way we have to go with the decision. So we used the nonpartisan staff to put together a friend of the court brief that went into this lawsuit at taxpayers' expense. I don't think it was right. If there's merit to the case, let the lawyers who are representing the clients plead their case. Don't use the government lawyers, the nonpartisan government lawyers, to feed into the system. It was just wrong, and it was a huge amount of money. If you were to go out and some of the lawyers in this room at their billable rates, it would have been several thousands of dollars.
Well, we're getting a little in the weeds, but I just want to correct the record for a second. It cost no money because this legislative staff, for all of us, would get a paycheck either way. They have to show up to work. It's not like we hired more people to do it. They just were doing their jobs that day. And if we're worried about the government money, then the governor shouldn't appeal the ruling because he's using the attorney general and other government folks as well. So we got to be careful about kind of how we're circling the drain here.
All right, so we'll move that on to time will tell.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about your respective caucuses and what your ideas are to address the deficit that we have. And Representative Sertich, to be fair, I'm going to start with you because you've got a little more say as far as in the House on what moves forward.
Sure, and I think this is a good point as well, is that everybody says we should cut. Well, nobody's actually, as I said before, I've come up with a way to totally solve this deficit. And when Kurt before talked about, well, it wasn't a balanced bill because the governor didn't agree with it. Nobody has come up with definitively where you can cut $1.2 billion or $5 and $8 billion down the road on either side. But I've been working with some state employees. I heard Kurt on the radio actually on NPR earlier this week said we should talk to some of our state employees and see where they think there's waste in government and cuts that need to be made. I've been working with our state employees since last year. They've found a few areas I think where we can save money. We can save, we've come up with $100 to $200 million, which doesn't solve the whole problem, but believe me, you're not going to talk to a lot of other folks that have come up with that many solutions as of yet.